Hello everyone, welcome to my channel Middleware Technologies. Today we will be looking at how we can authenticate using Keycloak OIDC in a Kubernetes cluster. Okay. In our last video, we have seen how we can use service account bearer token to configure our Kubernetes system for authentication. So here we are going to use Keycloak, which is an OpenID Connect compatible identity provider to authenticate in the Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so let us get started. So I'm using a one master and one worker node which is configured on Fedora 35 workstation. So this is the cluster which I'm working upon right now, version 1.23.x. Okay, so what is Keycloak? So as I said, Keycloak is basically a single sign-on identity provider which helps in securing our applications and services which are hosted in our systems. Okay, so basically it is an extension of the OAuth protocol, OAuth 2 protocol, which is actually an authorization protocol. So basically Keycloak acts as a authentication cum authorization protocol. It is an extension of OAuth 2, which is an authorization protocol, so it additionally provides the authentication services on top of authorization services. Okay, so what exactly Keycloak single sign-on or identity provider provides? Okay, so basically we register our applications using Keycloak, and once we register our application, we get client ID and client secret. So all the users who are authenticating against that client application all the users of a particular client application, when they authenticate it using the Keycloak identity provider, they are provided with a ID token. Basically it is a JSON web token which contains the authentication and authorization details of a particular user, which are used to authenticate the user. Okay, authenticate or authorize the user. So that is the purpose of using Keycloak. Okay, so let us see what steps we will be following in this video to configure our Kubernetes system in such a way that it authenticates with the Keycloak OpenID Connect provider and authenticates our users in the Kubernetes cluster to access the resources. Okay, so on a high level, first step, we'll be configuring our Keycloak service. Okay, so we need to have a Keycloak service up and running with some client application which we'll be using in this video. Okay, and the next thing is, once we have our Keycloak service up and running, we need to configure our Kubernetes API server so that it can access the Keycloak identity provider to validate the JWT token. Okay, so that is the second step that we will be carrying out as a part of this video. And the third one is basically we are going to create a role with a set of permissions and bind it to a particular user who is a part of a group, so that he can access the resources within a cluster. Okay. And the fourth step is generating the tokens. Okay, so as I said, the Keycloak authentication provider basically is an identity provider which, once authenticates the user, it provides a set of tokens which are called access token, ID token and refresh token. So we will be seeing how we can generate these tokens in this video. And once we have the tokens available, we can configure our kubectl in such a way that we can authenticate that user, with the Kubernetes cluster using the JWT token which we have generated in this last steps. Okay, and then we will see how we can access the Kubernetes cluster using the configured context with the JWT tokens. Okay, so in the last step, I will show you how exactly we can achieve that, and we will see how we can use a simple bash script to generate and refresh the tokens as a part of script. Okay, So as I said, the first step is to configure the Keycloak service. So we need to make sure the Keycloak service is up and running, and we need to register some client applications and users corresponding to that client application. Okay, so here is our Keycloak server. We need to have client applications registered, and we need to have some users respective to the client application added to the user, added to the identity provider. Now the next step is configure Kube API server. We need to update the API server YAML definition with the Keycloak OIDC provider configuration details. So what are those details that we need to configure on our Kube API server? So let us see those details. This is my Kube API server. So we need to have the OIDC issuer URL. So that is basically the Keycloak identity provider issuer URL that we need to add. We need to have the client ID configured, and this third one which I am showing, this is optional one, but we need to configure so that we know like what we want to authenticate with. So we need to add some claims which we are passing as a part of JWT token, which we want to authenticate with. And the fourth one is issuer certificate authority. So this is basically the certificate, that is the issuing certificate, which we need to configure in the Kubernetes API server. This issuing certificate is a certificate for the Keycloak identity provider, which we have configured in our first step. Okay, now coming to roles and role binding. So as I said, we will be creating a user or a group which is a part of a particular role. So basically we are creating a role with a set of permissions and binding that role to a particular group so that this role can be applied to all the users in a particular group. Okay, so this is let's say my role, and this is my user, which we are going to bind to that particular role. So this user is basically a part of group, the developer group, which we will be creating. So this is the very important step, generate shareability token. So here we are going to authenticate with the Kubernetes Keycloak OpenID Connect provider, and once we authenticate with a user, we will be provided with 3 tokens. So let us see what those are. So this is my Keycloak server, and once we authenticate with the Keycloak server, it provides our issues with the following tokens, which are ID token, which is called authentication token, refresh token, which is basically to refresh our tokens, and access token, which is authorization token. Okay. So in this, like the refresh token is the one which has a larger expire time, which we can use to refresh other tokens. Okay, but the ID token is going to expire soon. Like basically the default I think is 5 minutes. Okay, so let us proceed to our next step. So once we have our JWT tokens available, ID token, refresh token, and access token, so we need to configure our kubectl in such a way that we can authenticate with the identity provider. We can authenticate with the identity provider, and we can send the request to the Kubernetes API server with the JWT tokens, which we are going to configure in the kubectl. Okay. So this is my kubectl configuration, which will contain the provider issuer details, the OIDC issuer provider, issuer, client ID, client secret, and the request token ID token. So these are the 6 parameters that we are going to configure as a part of the kubectl configuration, so that it can connect with the identity provider. It can provide authentication with identity provider. So let us proceed to our next step, that is validating the access. So now we have our Keycloak service up and running. We have authenticated the user with the Keycloak service. We have configured our Kubernetes API server, and we have configured our Cubectl configuration so that the required details are provided as a part of the request, which goes to the Kube API server, which validates our request. Okay, so once the Kubernetes cluster API server validates our request, it provides access to that user using the JWT token, and we can get access to all the cluster resources based on the role which is applied to that particular group or user. So this is the high level flow diagram which we can get it from the Kubernetes documentation pages. So as you can see, the user authenticates with identity provider and is provided with 3 tokens, and this from this token, the ID token is the important token that, which contains the user details or authentication details. So this token we are going to use in the Cubectl configuration and authenticate with the send the request as a part send the request to the Kubernetes API server. This token is passed as a part of header, that is authorization bearer header. Okay, so once the API server gets the request with that authorization bearer holding the ID token, that request is again validated with the identity provider to make sure the JWT token is valid, and then it provides access to the resources. Okay, so this is how basically the flow of the request happens when we are using the Keycloak as an open identity provider as a part of the Kubernetes cluster authentication system. Okay, so let us see how we can achieve this in this practical exercise. So let me start my virtual machines wherein my Kubernetes cluster is hosted. So I think they are up and running now. Yeah. So let me log in into them. So this is my master. Okay, so now I have this master, one master and one worker node, as I said. So now let us start up our Keycloak service. Okay, so let me show you my Docker compose file quickly so that you get an idea of what exactly I'm using in the Keycloak as a part of service, Docker service. So this is my image 16.1.x, the Keycloak image that I'm using, and these are my default Keycloak user and password for the admin console, and I'm exposing my Keycloak service on 8443 and 8080. And I'm configuring the TLS certificates, this is self-site certificates which I have configured and volume mounted them. and I'm persisting my data locally, so that whatever configuration that I'm going to use or do in the Keycloak service, that is going to persist even when I restart the services. Okay, so as I configure the self-sign certificate, I'm going to use 84434 to access my Keycloak service. Okay, so now let us see, like, if we are able to access the Keycloak service. So this is the default URL which we need to access the admin console. Okay, the port 8443/auth and fqdn fedcubemaster in my case. Okay, so now we can access or log in with the admin credential, which are the default credentials that we have set up as a part of Docker service. Okay, now here, like, by default, when you access or login, like, you will be seeing only the master realm. So I have created one more realm using the add realm, and this is local realm. Okay, so once we have the realm created, we need to create our client. As I said, we need to register our application. So this is the application that I have registered, gatekeeper, and the client protocol is OpenID Connect, and access type is confidential. And I have configured the valid redirect URLs, that http/, so it will accept all the URLs that are part of HTTP and HTTPS. And once we have the client configured, okay, so the second thing that I have configured is client scope. Basically, it is like grouping a set of clients. So here I have created this group, and we need to map these attributes. Okay, the name attribute, user attribute, and the group attribute. So basically, what does this indicate is we are going to map these parameters as a part of that client, which when generates the JWT token, these tokens are going to be included as a part of that JWT token. Okay, and once we have the client scope created, we can map our client. Like here, we can map the group's client scope as a part of that client. Okay, so this is done with the client and client scope part. And here we can download our client configuration using Keycloak OIDC JSON download. So this contains all our details, basically the Keycloak authentication URL and the secret, and this is the client ID. Okay, now let us see the user corresponding to that clients. So we have created a static user named Alice. Okay, and we need to configure the credentials over here by providing the password and password confirmation and temporary password as off, so that we know there is no need to change the password again. Okay, and you can reset the password. Okay, and we need to map the attribute name called Alice. So basically what does this mean is this user is provided with a attribute called name, which is Alice, which is going to be sent as a part of user details. Okay, so this is the total configuration that I have carried out as a part of Keycloak. So let us see now what is the configuration on the API server that we have carried out. So right now, like, I am on my Kubernetes master server. So let us go into etc Kubernetes manifest. Okay, let me sudo So this is my Cube API server, so wherein we have configured these parameters, so which I indicated in my slides: the client ID, the claims, the issuer, and the CA certificate, which is the CIDR certificate of the Keycloak OIDC provider. Okay, in my case this is a self-signed certificate, and as you can see, like I am configuring a mount. Basically I am mounting my certificate at etc Kubernetes SSL, so for which we need to configure the volume. So we need to configure our volume mount, this part I've added, and the volume. Okay, so these are the changes that we have carried out as a part of Cube API server configuration, wherein we have added the OIDC provided details. So now we have seen like how we can like configure. So now we have seen the configuration of our Cube API server, and we have seen how we have configured our Keycloak service also. So let us see how we can configure now the Kubectl, so that we can send the request with the authentication tokens and authenticate with the Kubernetes cluster, with the Keycloak OIDC provider, and get access to the cluster. Okay, and one more thing I wanted to show is so this is basically the cluster role which we are going to apply, and the cluster role binding which we are going to use to bind the developer group to that particular cluster. Okay, so this is the you can use anything, basically any role binding, so that we can give the respective roles to the particular developer group in which the users are part of. Okay, so let me show you again a very basic role that you can apply. So this is the cluster role, which provides access to names, spaces, and pods, which is given access to this particular group. So you can configure this very basic cluster role and cluster role binding. Okay, so now let us see like how we can configure our Kubectl, so that we can send the request to the Kubernetes cluster with the authentication tokens. Okay, so here I have created a small script which basically takes all the details: the scope, OpenID, client ID, client secret, username, password, OIDC URL, and this is the rel. Basically OIDC URL is the endpoint, the token, the endpoint which is used to generate the tokens, and this is the rel URL which we have created, the rel local run which we have created. Okay, so these are the required details that we are going to use to configure our Cubectl configuration. Okay, so as a first step, we need to send the user, we need to authenticate with the Keycloak OpenID connect. So we need to like generate the token with grant type password. So basically we are going to send all these details, client ID, scope and client secret with username and password, to this token URL, so that it provides authenticates our user and provides a token. Okay, so once that tokens are available, so we are saving this into 3 token variables. Those are ID token, access token and refresh token. Okay, so I'm going to print those tokens over here and show you like how they look, and then we are going to introspect, basically get the details of our JWT token, that is ID token. Okay, so this is the step that is going to get the details of our JWT token. Okay, so once we have all this, we are going to configure our, we are going to create a new user and provide the credentials of the OIDC provider with all these details. Okay, and create a new context that is mapping that particular user or the OIDC user with the cluster. Okay, and then we are going to switch to that context and try to get the list of pods using that context. Okay, so let us see how we can configure our kubectl. Okay, so as you can see, like it has authenticated with the Keycloak OIDC provider, and that Keycloak OIDC provider has provided us with the 3 tokens, ID token, refresh token and access token. And then we have configured our Cubectl configuration with the OIDC provided details and the ID token and the other token, which is, let me show you. So we have configured our Cubectl configuration with the ID token and the refresh token. Okay, and the other details related to the OIDC provider. Okay, and once we have the ID token, so we introspect, like we get the details of that token. So as you can see from this introspect, you will get an attribute called name. So this is the attribute that we have added to the user, so that is getting added, and the group, that is developer. So these two are the claims that we are going to use to validate the JWT token. Okay, so once the authentication is done, like we are able to get access to our Kubernetes cluster and see the details of the cluster using that particular context. Okay, so that is how like I wanted to show you like how we can use the Keycloak OIDC provider to authenticate the users and get access to the cluster in this video. You can get more details about this Keycloak OIDC configuration using the like Kubernetes documentation. Like these are the links wherein you can get the details about the OpenID Connect tokens, like how we can configure it. And yeah, so this is my website. You can get all the content related to middleware technologies or DevOps related, whatever I'm carrying out. So you can just have a look at it, and if you like, you can follow me on this. And this is my YouTube channel, wherein I try to post my content related to my blog. And so in this video, like which I have created, like there is a corresponding blog for this one. So I'm going to provide the blog reference for you in that video description, so that you can get the details of the code whichever you want to use to configure the configuration. Okay, so thank you all. Thanks for watching this video, and you guys have a great day.